So in this video we're going to be making one of these crates with added drawers for storage, and we're going to be building out this one, but I also started with these two just to have a visual along the way with how things should work. So this one's obviously finished, and this one is finished up to the point before the false fronts are put on. And we'll use these to kind of see just how things line up in the crates. The materials that you will need for this project are going to be very inexpensive, arguably free if you are resourceful. Everything on this table, which is what I'm going to be building the drawers out of, and even the boxes themselves, are things that either I acquired over time from people giving them to me or items I got out of the trash. So the front of the cabinet, the drawers, can pretty much be anything you want, and that is reclaimed lumber. Then the rails that you put in there that the drawer rides on, we make a lot of custom cabinet fronts. And this is just leftover poplar I turned into rails from that project. Then the sides of the cabinets, the drawers, is going to be thin plywood that is actually taken off of dresser drawers that I got out of the trash, took apart and saved the lumber. And the original ones were obviously made with dovetails, but these drawers are small enough that we won't be using dovetails. And then the bottoms of those drawers are made from thin plywood that came from the same drawers as this. And the sides of where you mark how everything lays out, I have these spacers there, and that is also going to be made out of reclaimed wood from a kitchen cabinet. So you could pretty much use anything you want for all these materials. First step to this process is going to be deciding how many drawers you want and whether you're going to orient your final piece vertically or horizontally. For this one, I'm going to orient it vertically, and there's going to be 4 drawers. So in order to mark out, you can see the marks I made. You want these to be as symmetrical as possible. You want the drawers to be about the same size, unless you're going for a completely different look than what I have here. So I take the inside dimension of the opening, and it's going to be about 13 3/4. I took that number, divided by the number of drawers I want, which is 4, and got about 3 3/8. So I marked up 3 3/8, 3 3/8, 3 3/8, 3 3/8, and it ended up working out perfectly. Each one of these spaces is 3 3/8, and there's 4 of them. Once you have your marks of where everything is going, you can then cut your runners and your spacers for all of the sides. The wooden runners that the drawers will sit on are just simple rabbited poplar pieces. Now this poplar is left over from the other cabinets, but in general I get these pieces, like I said, as cutoffs from when we make cabinet fronts. So this piece of poplar is going to be 1 inch, and it comes standard at 3/4. And then I'm just going to run it through the table saw twice to notch out this little L. To make this first pass, I have my fence set to 1/4 inch, and my blade height is at 3/8 of an inch. And then I'm going to send it through Next, you're going to want to cut out this piece right here. So I lowered my blade to 1/4 inch, and I moved my fence over to 1/2 inch, and I'm going to send it through again. And that's about what you're left with. Once I have these cut, I kind of am using a scrap piece, and I'm going to plant it in the corner, because that is where your bottom drawer is going to sit. From there, I can now take a measurement from the top of the runner to the mark I made on the side of the box. And that is about 2 11/16. So now I can go rip all my spacers at 2 11/16 and start building the sides of these. Also, on the inside of the cabinet, I don't know if you could see it, I marked 3/4 of an inch back from the front, and that is because the false fronts that I'm putting on these are going to be no less than 3/4 of an inch, and they might be a little bit more. So you want to save that space to allow for that added thickness. So the height of my spacers will be 2 11/16, but measuring to that line, they're going to be about 6 5/16. So once I have these little spacers cut down to size, I also cut all of my rails, my runners, down to the same size. And I'm just going to dry fit everything in here to make sure it's going to work. So that's how it's going to look. And you can see that the height of my drawers matches up with each of my marks. So to finish this off, I'm just going to go through and add a couple brads to each of these spacers. I'm going to glue these in once everything's set, so I'm not going to put anything in those, and then do the other side. So now that I have all this set up, it's going to be time to make the 4 drawers. And I'm going to glue these in at the end. They're just going to be kind of in place for now. And I also added some screws to these panels. This is easier to do on one of these when it's a little bit wider, so your drill will fit in there. But I added some screws just so they don't move. So to make the drawers, I'm going to get rough dimensions between the runners. Obviously, front to back is going to be the same measurement as your spacers and your runners, and then the height, which is going to be, I'm going to make, it's actually 3 1/8, but I'm going to make it 3 inches because I like to give myself a little bit of wiggle room in all the drawers. So once I have those measurements, out of this scrap piece of cabinet, which is 3/8 of an inch, so I'll rip this down to 3 inches for the fronts. And then all the sides are going to be made out of these old drawer sides, which are a quarter, I think they're a quarter, maybe a little bit more. They're like 5/16. And normally when I make drawers, I connect the fronts with dovetails and the backs with the dado. But since these drawers are so small, I just don't reason the time commitment it would take to put dovetails or finger joints on these corners, unless you're planning on storing your valuable, expensive, heavy, precious metals in here. Little doodads are not going to be enough weight to ever make these come apart. So the basic construction of these is going to be rabbets in the front with some brads going through with glue, and still use dados in the back, and then obviously grooves cut out for the bottom. So I ripped all that down to 3 inches and then cut it down to size, which in my circumstances is going to be 5 11/16. Then I took one and measured the thickness of my sides and made a mark. I'm going to use my miter gauge to cut all these rabbets, and I set my fence so the blade will cut right through that mark, and then lowered it to about halfway through the thickness of my lumber. And then on both sides I'll cut all those rabbets with one setup. Now that I have my rabbets cut out of the sides, while this height's set up, I'm going to cut the groove on the inside of the cabinet to receive the bottom piece. So I move my fence to a 1/2 inch. I'm going to run each one through, then move it slightly up about a 1/16 and send it through again to make that groove. now that I have all the fronts cut, I could put my sides in that rabbet and measure for the length of my sides. Now the cabinet spacers were 6 and 5/16, and I'm going to give myself a little bit of wiggle room in case there's any undulations in the back of that box. So instead of 5/16, I'm going to make these 6 1/4. So from the front of my drawer, I'm going to measure back 6 1/4 and mark it, and then cut out all my sides. So with my stack of sides cut out, I'm going to cut the groove on the bottom for the bottom of the drawer. So I moved my fence back over to a 1/2 inch and lowered my blade to go about halfway through the piece. And I'm going to send all these through and then move it back over a little bit and send them through again. Last thing to be done before I can attach these to the fronts is cutting the dado in the back to receive the back of the drawer. So I could keep my fence at a 1/2 inch because it's going to be a 1/2 inch from the back, and I could keep the height of my blade. And I'm just going to run these through like I cut these because it's going to be the same thickness, and move it and cut it again. Now the thing to remember about these is if you cut 8 identical, you'll have 4 wrong because they are not identical. On 4 of them, you're going to send it through with the groove in the back, and on 4 of them you're going to send it through with the groove facing forward, so that when you put the drawer together, your backs line up. At this stage, I like to attach the front to my sides. It's easier to measure for the back and the bottoms, I feel, with those two together. So in order to do that, I'm just going to put some glue in this rabbet and then some 5/8 inch brads through the front. So with my sides attached, I can now cut for my back and my bottoms. And in order to make sure that those measurements are correct, I put a little clamp on the back to square up the front with the sides. As soon as those are square, I could come in and take my measurement, which is going to be 5 5/16, which means the width of the bottom will also be 5 5/16. The other thing about the back is, with this dado, your bottom only goes to the top of where your bottom panel is. So I'm going to measure from the top down, and that's 2 3/8. So now I know I can cut my backs 5 5/16 by 2 3/8. As well as my bottoms, which will be 5 5/16. And to the back, since you're going in about 1/4 in the front, we'll go to the back and add 1/4, which will be about 5 1/2. So now I'm going to cut my 4 backs and my 4 bottoms. So with the bottom slid in place, I'm going to add some glue to these rear dados. So I tested the drawers and they all fit, and before I put them in there to do the fronts, I'm going to glue all of my runners in. I'm just going to put glue in all these grooves, and then while it's setting up, I'll just put a brad or two through the front of these to keep them in place, and then I'll put the drawers in there to kind of hold them down with their weight. So with these glued in place, and now the glue drying on the drawers, I'm just going to pop everything into place and let it all dry for, it's pretty warm out today, so probably only about half an hour to an hour before I add the fronts. In order to finish this up, I have to add the false fronts to all of my drawers. Now I usually fit each of these individually because this box is most likely not square in everyone's case, in my case it is not, and because there's a little bit of a gap on the top, so this will be thicker than the rest. I'm going to fit each of them separately. I have this piece of reclaimed lumber that actually came off of, this piece of trim off of one of the houses in town. And I like the separation of the two pieces. So in order to do this, because I'm going to end up orienting them like this, I'm going to trim a little off both sides to get my height. And we're going to start with 3/8 of an inch. Each of these is going to be 3/8 of an inch. This one's going to be 3 1/2. So I actually have a couple pieces of this. So this one I'll do for the 3/8, and then I'll fit the top one last. So now that I have my rough 3/8 inch blank, I'm going to measure the width. And this bottom one's just about 6 3/4, so I'm going to cut it a little shy of that. I'm going to take the blanks and just set them where they would go, and then keep cutting, measuring and cutting up for the rest. And I haven't decided how I want to orient this pattern yet. I might keep it like that, or even every other one flip it. But I'm going to see what it looks like once it's all together. The last one I have to fit is the top one, and you can see that what you're doing, what the goal is for this, is you want the front of the drawer before it to come right to the bottom of the runners, which will give you enough to leave a little gap in between, and then it lines up at the bottom all the way up. So all the bottom ones worked out to be the same size, but this top one's gonna need to be a little bit thicker. And instead of 3 3/8, it looks like it's gonna be 3 1/2 for the top. When I have the boards oriented the way I want and the fit is fairly consistent, you know, with about a little bit of a gap around all the edges and a little bit of gap between each of the panels, I'm going to take my brad nailer and sink 4 brads in each front just to hold them in place when I take them out and attach the knobs. In order to finish these drawers up, I'm going to take each one out, and I'm going to countersink 2 holes into the inside. And then put in 2 1.25". Once that's done, I'm going to mark my center by lining up my diagonals. Now, the hardware you're putting on any of these drawers could be anything you want. I just happen to have these older wooden knobs with a paint color that surprisingly kind of matches the one on there. And I just kind of roughed up the paint on the outside. I'm going to use that to attach it. Now if you're using thicker material like I am, the hardware they give you won't work. So with your center march, drill your hole. And then all I did was I took this 2.5-inch drywall screw and I just kind of nipped off about 3/4 of an inch off the end. And now that's long enough to screw on my knob. And then this is going to be the finished piece with the working drawers. Now you can refinish these any way you want. I'm probably going to end up selling these online, so I'm not really going to put a finish on them, and then if someone wants some polyurethane or something, I'll do that after the fact.